Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that's going to be optics, specifically LPVOs, and if they're truly the best general purpose optic, or if that's more of a trap, and they're really a more specialized optic masquerading as something that can do everything. But before we get into that, while you're here, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, as that is free, and it does help us out quite a bit. And on top of that, go ahead and comment your favorite LPVO, prism, or red dot magnifier setup in the comments down below. Full disclosure, we're going to be talking about a lot of different concepts and specific optics, of which I may or may not have various relationships with, so take everything with a grain of salt. Also, of course, there's a near infinite combination of optics and parts that I haven't used in conjunction with each other, so keep that in mind as well, that this is going to be based mostly off of my perspective. Now, currently I really enjoy using LPVOs. And why is that? That's because here in South Dakota, when I'm shooting out in the grasslands, I can shoot for approximately 2 miles, whereas somebody who's living in the Pacific Northwest, like I used to, maybe a 100-yard sightline, a 200-yard sightline is a little bit more difficult. The first thing about an LPVO, in my opinion, an LPVO is something that has a 1x. If it does not have a 1x, it's not an LPVO, it's a mid-power variable optic, an MPVO. There are lots of optics in the MPVO category like this Night Force 2.5 to 10, which is not as good as you might think it is, or the one behind me that was actually sent out by Maven, that's a 2.5 to 15, which is a near perfect magnification range for anything outside of close quarters. If you're shooting at even out to 1,000 yards, 15x magnification is plenty for me. Now let's get back to the L in LPVO, the low power variable optic, that these have a approximate 1x, which is kind of a trap that a lot of people get into because they think that this is actually going to be very good at everything. The problem with LPVOs is that 1x it's not actually 1x. You are looking through many panes of curved glass to give you a approximate 1x image, and it's usually not quite accurate. Of course, there's a wide variety of quality of 1x images on LPVOs. Some are very good and some are very poor. Even on the high end, some LPVOs have a very poor 1x approximation. Now, this is going to get into the range dilemma where we're talking about the 1x on an LPVO versus a truly non-magnified image like a red dot or holographic sight or similar. Now, talking about distances, inside of 100 yards, personally, there is never a reason to pick an LPVO over a red dot. One of the most common questions that I personally get is, hey, I'm building a new build. Should I go with a 1 to 6 LPVO or should I go with a red dot? And the answer is always, where are you going to actually use the thing? And if your answer is, well, I only ever shoot within 100 yards, again, you might like the look of an LPVO, you might like to be able to dial that magnification up to 6, 8, 10 on the top end, but inside of 100 yards, you're never going to actually be able to utilize that magnification, and you're almost always going to be served better by a red dot, and there's a few reasons for that. Number one is that if we're talking about the value discussion, a minimum acceptable quality, a MAC red dot, is around 100 to 150 bucks for a Romeo 5, a Holosun 400 series, or name your favorite cheap red dot that will get the job done. Is it going to perform like higher end options? Of course not. It's not going to have the same durability, the same quality control, but it will get the job done. The MAC on a red dot is again about 100 to 150 bucks. The MAC on a LPVO is about $250 to $300. So you're looking at nearly double the cost to get a minimum acceptable quality out of your option. And again, if we're inside of that 100 yards, you're never really going to get to use that 6x or at least have a real need for it unless you're shooting like 2-inch targets at 100 yards. Now, there's two other major issues with LPVOs. Of course, the price to quality ratio isn't as good. The second, the performance per weight ratio is very bad, usually speaking like a lightweight LPVO plus mount setup, which adds additional cost most of the time as well. You're looking at around 20 ounces on the minimum, which is about quadruple the weight of a similar quality red dot that's also quite a bit cheaper. And of course, a tandem issue with weight is of course size. These are usually a little bit on the bulky. Even some of the more compact LPVOs are going to be much larger than even a red dot and magnifier combo. Now, if we throw in a red dot and magnifier, the value proposition gets very close. For instance, if you throw in a $150 magnifier with a $100 red dot, well, now you're at the bottom end of LPVOs. You're still probably a little bit lighter. You kind of extend your distances a little bit with a red dot. You have a little bit better positive ID. You might have a little bit better minimum point blank range where you can kind of just see the target in more detail. But again, if your use case is within 100 yards, you probably don't even need a magnifier. And the third issue with LPVOs is that in general, There's a lot of exceptions to this rule, but in general, they are less durable than a similar quality red dot. So you're going to have more issues with these, and you're not really going to get the benefit again unless you're shooting out to more extended ranges. So let's talk about the ranges. Inside of 200 yards, there's still not that much advantage to having an LPVO, with the exception if you're shooting very low probability targets, like a headshot at 200 yards is going to be easier with more magnification than just a bare red dot will be. They're still both makeable shots and doable shots, but I think that most people will be more comfortable taking that shot with more magnification, whether that's just 4, 6, 8, or even 10 on the high end. Now, of course, you can somewhat alleviate that with a red dot and magnifier combo. Another advantage of the red dot magnifier combo is that you can simply detach the magnifier with a QD mount if your magnifier of choice comes with that, so you don't need to deal with the extra size, weight, and bulk. For me personally, the LPVO really starts to shine in a very narrow window of about 300 to 500 yards, and that's the vast majority of LPVOs. Now, you can always take LPVOs further, of course, but that's not going to be ideal. If we want to go further than 500 yards, that's where we start to get into the MPVO territory. In general, a similar quality MPVO is going to be a little bit more expensive than a similar quality LPVO. And of course, you're going to get a little bit heavier, so your drawbacks start to add up, with the trade-off being that you get a lot more precision at distance. So the LPVO, while it can function, of course, just fine inside of 100 yards, you can be very quick with it. It really starts to shine at those extended distances. For instance, a long time ago, I was doing a 3-gun match, and on one of the stages, I knew that we were going to be shooting out to 500 yards. Now, that is doable for sure with a red dot magnifier combo. However, for me, I felt much more comfortable doing it with an LPVO, where I could true out that specific distance with that ammo within the reticle that I had in that optic, and it worked out great the day of the match. And that's why you're going to see a lot of 2- and 3-gun competitions dominated by LPVO users in terms of the rifle, of course, because that versatility is hard to pass up, because you get something that can absolutely work up close, but is also going to be stretched to 600 yards. Now, translating that to you personally, the viewer watching this, if you never have the ability or intention of shooting beyond 200 yards, other than it might look kind of cool or be different enough to scratch that itch, or you just want to try it out, you're probably not getting very much value out of an LPVO. Now, again, where I live here in South Dakota, where again I can shoot out to 2 miles if I wanted to. I do a lot of shooting inside of, let's say, 500 yards, and then occasionally I'll stretch out to like 1,000 yards with something else. But for me personally, an LPVO makes a lot of sense and allows me to do just about anything I need to do. Now, if I go to one of the more public ranges where it's only out to 100 yards, in those circumstances, I would always prefer just a red dot or red dot and magnifier if I feel like I want it at those 100-yard shots. So again, while LPVOs on paper look very general purpose, and another thing about on paper is people think that, well, 8x is better than 6x and 6x is better than 4x, so that means 10x must be the best. But usually 10x on an LPVO comes with a lot of downsides. For instance, you get even bigger and heavier. Usually speaking, your eye box gets worse. Your reticle has to be more complicated if it's first focal plane, which is a totally different discussion. But for most LPVO users, 6x, 8x, perfectly acceptable. Bigger number is not always better, and having that 1 to 6, having that versatility on paper doesn't necessarily always work out if it's all wasted. So again, if you're not shooting into that mid-range 300 to 500 yards, it's more expensive, it's heavier, it's less durable, it's a lot bulkier, and you're not actually getting any of that extra versatility that is there on paper. It just might look nice on top of your rifle. So again, the value proposition and what most people, the majority of people, actually need or want on their rifle is going to be a decent value red dot in whatever price category you happen to be looking at, and possibly a magnifier if you feel like you need it. So really, the LPVO for me is more niche, because unless you're shooting between 300 and 500 yards regularly, or if you're doing a competition where you're shooting out to 600 yards on a stage, it's really not all that useful. And again, if we're shooting beyond 600 yards, well, now we move into a different category of scopes altogether. So for me, it's a pretty niche optic, and usually it's more expensive. It has all the other downsides we've already mentioned. So again, I like LPVOs. I think, of course, they have a place in the market. The majority of my personal rifles are red dots, and the LPVO builds are a little bit more specialized to actually take advantage of what these things can give you. But with all that out of the way, guys, let me know what you think of LPVOs versus red dots versus prisms versus MPVOs in the comments down below. And with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off.